take your seats. Please make yourself comfortable. And please come closer, please. Don't hide in the background. Just like come close so that we have the opportunity also to talk to each other and to get the interaction as it was emphasized by one of our previous speakers. Really welcome everybody. My name is Markus Arbenz. I'm the Executive Director of iForm Organics International, and I represent actually the organic movement, the global organic umbrella, and I'm quite happy actually to go now to the second part of the sessions. So those who have witnessed actually the first part of the session have already met Antonio. Antonio, my host and mediator and good friend. What he has done actually, he has put all his weekly diet of his family on the table, and that's actually what we're going to have a look at it a little bit more in detail. And yeah, we restart actually with connecting to our topic, feeding the planet sustainably or not at all, and how can we start better than with the food itself. Antonio, we have already talked a little bit about the fresh food. We have talked about the habit of your family that you cook yourself. But maybe you tell us a little bit more, because I see that you have brought your recipes and your ingredients, and let's talk a little bit about cooking.
Yes, we enjoy very much cooking, and I think it is nice to say how it came out. It came out about 30 years ago. I was traveling around the world, and I had an experience of living abroad for 13 months, most of the time in foreign countries, really outside of Europe, like Australia, New Zealand, and the United States and Canada. And I missed my food because wonderful places, but I'd been raised in a, let's say, in a small village town when my generation, 59 years old now, it's, no, 59, born in 59, so 56. I experienced the real local diet with my mother and grandmother producing all the food. But I was not really absorbing much at that time. I was young and wanted to discover the world. But discovering the world and discovering the food sometimes is not exactly what you expect and what you have in your background. So I learned from my uncle that immigrated in Canada the old family recipes of making pasta, making bread and so on. And I transferred back home again, check it out with my, what became my wife, that had another family, so bring together. To make it short, once a week at least we make fresh pasta. That is a characteristic of my region, because we traditionally don't have to wheat. That is the one that you have to produce this kind of pasta that everybody knows about. But what we produce is, for example, tortelloni. Tortelloni is egg. You use the eggs, you use the flour, and then you make a pasta that is thin enough, but not too much. And then inside, you put what here is missing because there was nothing in the shop: ricotta cheese and either spinach or stinky tomatoes. That is also something that you don't grow, but you put it and you put it inside. And then we use olive oil instead of butter that used to be the original recipe, and sage. Sage. That's very easy to do and very happy for our kids and for us as well. Another thing we produce is, for example, with potatoes, we produce gnocchi. That is my wife's specialty, or tortelloni as well. My specialty is rice, risotto, that is here. Normally we have Italian rice. We have a tradition of growing rice in all North Italy. And I'm the master of making risotto, so I have my recipe. Normally, when there is a season, we love it with pumpkin, and then I cook with onions, very thin, because my kids don't like to see it too big, and the vegetable broth, and little by little I pour it out, and at the end I put a little bit of butter. My wife doesn't, usually don't, but I put it, and as final, a little bit of prosciutto on top of it. I'm not vegetarian, I'm not perfect, but We really use little meat. We don't see it here, but normally we do have at least once a week either red or white meat, and we have fish. Here is an example of the trout, but of course we don't get it packed, we get it the full fish, local one, and we do clean it and put it in the freezer and then use it. Of course you need Parmesan also. There is quite a lot of Parmesan. You see, for a week we have about a kilo of Parmesan cheese, but it's produced locally. It's our normal production. Usually I get it from a farmer that was the first one to do it organic back in 1980, before the regulation. And it's interesting to show how he went more beyond organic. He's now doing, he made a breeding with the local breeds, and now he has these red cows. Before I was talking white cows in Modena, originally that is the province just beside. We have traditionally another breed, and this with long horns and are very, very rustic, and they produce also a milk that is extremely full of casein. But the innovation he brought was to bring back, is in an area where he has small springs, and used to be permanent grass. That normally in a Parmesan you don't. You have the feeding of the cows, even in non-organic farms, is done without silage. So it's anyway very sustainable, and the rotation of the crops and everything. But in this case, he's putting them on pasture, and I see the difference in the cheese because it's much more yellow and tastes in a extremely way. We are trying to bring the farmers that direction. That's, I think, enough.
Okay, thank you, Antonio. I think thank you for sharing also these Italian secrets, which could be, or which are definitely interesting for the whole world. We are talking here about feeding the planet sustainably or not at all. That's actually the theme which we look at it today. We had already an overview of several issues, and we looked at regulations particularly, we looked at distribution particularly, but there are two more topics which we would like to deepen in this conversation. This is on the one hand science and tech innovation, and on the other hand, I think Antonio has just introduced us that local food systems. So these are potentially axes of the solution when it comes to food security. And to discuss this, I would like to introduce our panel. Our panelists, they're all now coming from the organic movement. These are, well, I could call them activists, maybe they don't like this term, but they're definitely very engaged from their positions, be that as a consultant, be that as a scientist, be that as advisor to local communities in the north or also in the south, in Africa, or also being part of development cooperation from an NGO perspective. All these are actually sitting here on the panel, and I would like to introduce you Christopher Stopes. Christopher Stopes from the UK, being president of IFOM-EU and consultant at the same time. Timothy LaSalle, coming from the United States, but having worked a lot in Africa, Zimbabwe, and has experience, actually, one could say he's a really global person. And he has done extensive work in research, but also extensive work in interaction directly with the people which know what that means being hungry. I would like to introduce you Frank Mechtelsen, so my Dutch is not very good, coming from the Netherlands and working for HEWOS. HEWOS been tremendous help and enormous good partner for IFOM Organics International, for the organic movement, having realized the potential actually to use the organic movement for change, for social changes in the societies, and we have actually a strategic relationship in the meantime for decades, which is extraordinary for IFOM, but it's also extraordinary for HEWOS. So, yeah, Antonio, I don't need to introduce, we have already interacted a lot. So we will start with the contribution from Tim. Tim, you will actually look into, let me see, your title once again. Innovation for the planet and people, priorities for action. Tim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Marcus. It's a pleasure to be here. And I just want to frame, because a lot of my talk will be putting things into a contextualization. and a perspective. And one of the things in the past number of decades for me has been to try and understand the human psyche with respect to the trajectory we find ourselves on. And I've been in over 90 countries over the course of decades. And it struck me just a few years ago, my wife and I were spending our time in Africa with the Howard Buffett Foundation, that in fact, where is our time best spent? Where the effects of climate change are showing themselves most radically already, or in the first world, where our consumptive levels are driving the disaster of climate change. And that's a tension. But one of the things that I think that we're coming forward on, and I don't know if these slides can come up, is that in fact, we're driving climate change so rapidly that the point about innovation and where we come probably is going to be beyond our reach to be able to challenge or create an adaptation to the radical nature of where climate is going. Africa has seen it, and it has seen it today, and it suffers from it today. And I'll just make a comment about that. We were with some farmers in Ghana, and the rain had not come, and a suicide was committed by a farmer because he could no longer provide for his family, whereas conventionally, traditionally, historically, they've always had rains come on specific dates almost within their growing seasons. They knew it had changed. These illiterate farmers knew it was climate change, and they said, yes, we've cut all of our trees. And they were blaming it on themselves. It's true that didn't help. It's true it warmed the ground. But the first world are the ones that have been pouring the high levels of this carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And so when we're talking about innovation and where are we going to feed the planet of 9 billion people, we can't decontextualize that and pull it out of the fact that we've already overshot. The fact that there's already too much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now I have control of this, don't I? Somehow. Let's see if that works. We've overstepped ourselves. And this graphic says, look at how rapidly this has come upon us. That we were at 74% of biocapacity by some estimations in 1961, within most of our lifetimes, not everybody in here. By 1986, we'd overstepped to 114%, and today we're at 156% and growing. So for the planet's ability to bioremediate the pollutions we're dropping into its sphere, including its atmosphere, it doesn't have that capacity. The products that we're mining from her and utilizing, putting through our economic throughput systems, she does not have the capacity to regenerate, to recreate those for us at these paces. So as my wife and I stepped onto this facility again today, it was her first time, and she said to me, she said, gee, it's wonderful, but is this responsible for tomorrow, this investment of all these buildings, of all the CO2 that this is creating, and of how it's impacting the globe? We in America are the biggest CO2 emitters per capita in the world. And this is where one of the reasons we've come back to America, to see what it is we can do to help shift this process. So innovation is the title. And I'm going back to an innovator here, a dung beetle, thinking in terms of how the biological processes have innovated and have learned to sequester carbon, how learned to build fertility, how the biological processes, if we study them scientifically, we can begin to understand how the real innovations, the only innovations that will create wealth with regard to food and water and a clean atmosphere, come back to nature, and we need to understand them. See, the odd thing is that right now, and there was an environmentalist in the United States, Bill McKibben, some of you may have read some of his books, he was one of the first ones to write on climate change, has started an organization called 350.org. And a lot of the young people in the world, around the world, got involved in 350.org with the idea of let's hold our parts per million at 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide. And that means we shouldn't raise our temperature more than 2 degrees Celsius. And some of the scientists are saying that's a livable level. problematically, what happens with that idea is that there's an assumption, okay, just like one of the earlier speakers mentioned, well, in Europe, maybe we're going to be able to grow some different crops because of warming trends. And I've been to so many speakers and researchers that talk about the global warming. Well, where we grow things will start to shift in the planet. Nowhere are those scientists or speakers engaging the conversation of climate chaos, not warming. Climate chaos means maybe no rain or way too much rain. It maybe means you get your rain in 1 week instead of over 3 months. And so the temperature shift is not going to be the question. It's going to be the chaotic nature that will disrupt our ability to grow food. And this is where I find us in a very curious situation right now that we're at 400 parts per million. We're already beyond that 350 discussion of what we thought was sustainable. Jim Hansen of NASA is explaining to us very clearly it will be so chaotic that civilization will be disrupted at 350. And we're now at 400. So the future is not a question of sustainability. We don't have that option anymore. And it's odd to me that we even have discussions around the point that climate change is controversial. Controversial science is when it's sort of 50-50. This is 97.3%. It's not controversial. The physicists are pretty clear about what's going on and what will happen. I think that Paul Ehrlich, who wrote the book The Population Bomb, that didn't transpire as fast as he had suggested, and food becomes short as fast as he suggested, still came up with a rather elegant and simple formula. Environmental impact simply equals population times affluence times technology. Well, to visit with many of the young people, in the audiences I visit with the young people, lots of times they think and been told and been taught that technology will save us. Instead of understanding technology has helped bring us beyond a capacity to support ourselves on this planet. And we could go on and on and on about the multitude of technologies. There are very, very, very few rare occurrences where technology has helped us on our ecological and environmental impacts. It mostly pushes into consumption of my computer, of my jet airplane flight here, that is damaging to the environment. So I'm going to start from an innovation standpoint of a technology that came along in fertilizer. In fertilizer, if we go back to our old soil science courses, we're taught basically NPK, which is not showing up so well there, but in the green, NPK is the fertilizer typically that we need to put on the soil to grow our crops. What NPK has done to our soils is continue to exacerbate the biological balances and burn up the carbon. And research has shown where these fertilizers activate particularly bacteria that eat the organic matter much more rapidly. And I'm sorry, the slide, as I transferred it to PowerPoint, it shifted. On the right-hand side is the nutrient that I'm going to argue from an innovation that has to come back as the primary fertilizer for our soils, and that's carbon. And my soil science class never had that as something to apply. It's carbon. Carbon is the chain of life. It's the cycle of life. It's what life is built from. And we're pulling it out of our soils every time we put a tractor in the field and plow and disc and turn that soil. We're pushing it out of the soils and exporting it into the atmosphere every time we use the fertilizers. And so we're headed in the wrong direction when we get our beautiful John Deeres involved. Normally, we get them involved for other reasons in other places, but normally it's problematic. So with this fertilizer, here's two examples. When I was at the Rodale Institute the last year before I left to go work in Africa, there was a heavy rain year, and there we had 13 replications of tractor-sized plots that had been in the field for 30 years, and we'd only increased soil carbon a couple of % in the organic plots, but it was substantial. But when you look at that, and you look at applications of conventional chemical fertilizers in the plots that were farmed conventionally and with Roundup, etc., with the heavy rain environment, the fertilizer washed away and the plants look yellow and they perform poorly. But in the organic systems, they were robustly green down to the last leaf until the day frost came. no yellowing on those plants at all. And that was either from a manure-based system or a cover crop-based system as the nitrogen source. Biological, nature, and time released, because the biology is involved in the system and we're building the robustness of it. Where did that fertilizer go with respect to the chemical? It went leached and it went into the streams. One of the things we're learning is that that nitrogen and those phosphorus and those other fertilizers that are leaching into our waterways, from the nitrogen perspective, is increasing nitrous oxide emissions globally, which is the worst of all climate change gases. Between methane and carbon dioxide, it's the nitrous oxide. Well, it's also creating dead zones globally. Now there are over 400 dead zones. I saw one statistic said 500. So what we're doing is we're killing the biological life in our oceans. A lot of this, a majority of this, by most studies and discussions, come from agricultural runoff and fertilizers. Again, technology is having this environmental impact. These waters warm, adding to global warming. It is not an innovation or technology that's helpful. In Africa, one of the things that I challenged was, because when I got there, is that they said, we can't afford to fallow anymore. We don't have enough land, and we simply need every piece of land to grow food for hungry people. So in one of my demonstration fields that I divided into 6 crops to rotate through during one season to the next, I decided to risk all of that and go against conventional wisdom and said, I'm going to fallow. Now this is a lab bean that you could harvest for food, and some countries would shoot me for incorporating this. And the way I incorporated it was not with a plow or a disc, it was just to shred it down and leave it on top of the surface of the soil. And what was the result when I rotated maize in the next year? It was a 5-fold increase in yield. I had 5 times the food production off of that maize plot because I summer fallowed with something that produced this much biomass and this much nitrogen. This is the potential of coming back to using the biology and thinking in terms of being sure the carbon stays with our fertilizers, in other words, the biomass of this material. And this is the innovations that we cannot just not forget. We have to reinvest our knowledge into it and reinvest our science into it and begin to incorporate it into the principles of growing food for people. One of the plants and beans I discovered there was a bush mucuna, and mucuna's been used around the world as a green manure, as a nitrogen source, as a biomass producer, but typically it's a vine mucuna that will grow up this corn plant. But I found some seed for a bush mucuna, and these are some field trials in Ghana, and the field behind, if you noticed, in the back has nothing planted below the corn, and the field in front where this maize has this bush mucuna. So what are we doing here? We're doing something that makes much more sense because we're trying to raise carbon levels, raise fertility levels, raise biodiversity levels. We've increased we've doubled the biodiversity of plant life in this because we have a legume and a grass. But more importantly is we're using every inch of photosynthesis in that field. Every inch of photosynthesis is being utilized, and biomass and nitrogen are being produced instead of just the maize taking nutrients from the system. And that mucuna will be left on the ground to decompose. In rain short year in Pennsylvania, there was a study done. What happens when we start to leave it? We get all kinds of ecosystem services, which means in the case here where we had a rain short year, again, of these 13 replicated trials, here's 2 where we had corn side by side. In the conventional fertilizer system, without enough rain, you see how much it's struggling. Interestingly enough, the organic system was planted 2 weeks later to avoid the corn rootworm, its life cycle, so we didn't have to spray. So it's 2 weeks younger, but look at how much more robust and healthy it is. Because we've invested in the soil biologically. We've invested in the soil from a carbon standpoint. What happens when we're adding carbon, we're starting to feed biomass and the organic matter. We're starting to feed the biology and create balances. And the balances are really crucial from the standpoint of getting the biodiversity you need to protect your crops, the health of the plant itself to resist damage, etc. Well, then maize, I'm growing in areas here in Africa where it was a big commercial farm before Howard Buffett bought it. And there, of course, all the pests were there, all the chemicals were used, etc. But as we started to build the biodiversity, I would certainly get a corn earworm starting to eat the top of that corn. But with enough biodiversity, I would get the birds that would flood in and pull the worm out. And I never got damage worse than this. So why would I spray it? Why would I put a worker at risk with chemicals? Why would I put the food at risk with chemicals? And why would I disrupt the biological balances? So that's a very, very simple run of saying it doesn't have a perfect image, but I've lost almost none of my crop. And I've put nobody at risk, nor the environment. Conservation agriculture is not just an overlay, it's a really critical element. And I got very involved and spoke a lot on the African continent about this from a biological organic sense, whereas this system is pretty well co-opted, at least in the United States, by Monsanto and Roundup. But in essence, we know the real damages that those bring into ecosystems. But when we come into a conservation agriculture approach, we have three basic elements that need to be followed, which is minimum soil disturbance, crop rotation, and permanent soil cover. Now, permanent soil cover is the next best thing to permanent roots in the ground. Permanent roots in the ground, like in pastures and grasses and permanent plantings, host particularly fungi like mycorrhizae, and that keeps a very healthy environment going in the soil. But keeping cover at least continues to keep the temperature and moisture at a more constant level, and it provides food systems for the earthworms and for other organisms that will start to break it down in the system and leave some of the organic matter there. What happens when you bring the tractor in? This was a field right next door to my studies and my demonstration farms. And I was gone for a couple of weeks, and the farm manager said, you know, that place where you planted a summer cover of mixed crops, the weeds are getting away from us. He said, can I disc it? And I thought, yeah, the weed pressures are huge. And I said, okay, disc it one time. Here's what happens. One time, one rainstorm, erosion. Am I getting in trouble on time already, Marcus? I'll rapidly go through. Here's a picture in Burundi. And what we have in Burundi is one of the poorest countries in the world. And how do we cultivate and prepare for planting? We dig up every inch of the soil. And what do we get? We get erosion. Erosion remains one of the biggest problems in the world, where we've heard in an earlier speaker, half of our soils are gone. So what happens is in here, the center picture is a picture of my fields where I didn't plow, I didn't put a tractor in there, I didn't put the oxen in there, and it was biological. So that was sand, the same sand that washed away in the other field. Look at how it's holding together. The field that washed away is the jar on the left. It immediately dissolved. And so aggregation begins to hold together our soils for the future, and we have to rebuild. I will step to say we had to modify an animal-powered, tractor-powered seeder because it would not work in the system. And by modifying it, we created some row cleaners so we could get the seed to actually connect with the soil, and that was a simple innovation. Here's a no-till experiment, part of the research trials were set up in Ghana, and there's cowpeas in the beginning here, a plot where lack of rain produced a near crop failure. The plot in back, one season, no-till, provided a sustainable crop, would provide a sustainable crop. I won't talk about roller crimper. I learned how to do peanuts no-till, and I didn't think that was possible. Of course, I'd never grown peanuts before, or groundnuts. It was important that we're not disturbing that soil. So I'm not going to talk about the problems of that. We tried to work on the brown revolution with Howard. And I want to go to what is the pink revolution and mention it. And Joel Bourne, I'm stealing this term from him or borrowing it from him, because in fact, if we don't, as was said a little bit in the last discussion, start to think in terms of the fact that population growth will be the largest in Africa. Women produce half the world's food right now. And if we don't invest in an economic, educational, political, sexual, and land title equity, we will not feed the world. because they are core to this. Women spend 90% of their income on their families. Men spend 30%. It's a really crucial element. Do women need access to what most development people talk about? And that is farm credit. Maybe. Maybe this is not the innovation that's needed. The only thing I could see, because I limited my experiments and trials and demonstrations to no outside inputs, except it showed me I needed hybrid maize seed. Could not get the yields out of OPV seeds, open pollinated. So that might be where they need to purchase. Fertilizers, I'd say no. Commodity markets, we can have a discussion on that one. Where does that take them? So innovations, I'm terming this regenerative organic because organic can be a high input, a high soil eroding, non-sustainable activity. If it's not regenerative at the outset, we are not going to feed the world. So conservation agriculture needs to be a part of that. High biodiversity, some hybrid seeds. On a larger scale, we can talk about equipment, and there has to be an investment in humans. Can we survive? We said no on the 350 parts per million. Can we get back to where we need to be? And what's amazingly wonderful, because Urs knows this, I made radical statements that we could sequester 100% of our carbon dioxide. Marcus knows this. Through different ways of managing land. While I was gone in Africa, I come back to find a researcher at New Mexico State University that is hugely more optimistic than that statement based on research he's done on a different way of composting. Now grazing systems that are as optimistic as the researcher in New Mexico, showing data out of Georgia Tech and out of Australia that are talking about ways for us to get there. With the right incentives, the right policies, and the right education, there is one way and only one way to correct our atmospheric excesses, and that's through the soil. And that's through a regenerative organic process. And with that, I will stop, Marcus. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. Thank you so much for reminding us actually that it's always about making possible what we think is not possible. So that's, we'll remember that phrase. Very nice actually how you showed us actually what kind of very practical solutions are there, very practical solutions are possible that we want actually to make. Thank you very much for this inspiration. We are already a little bit over time, but nevertheless, if there is a question in the room, I still want to give space to that. Well, this seems not be the right case, but we will hear Tim back when we come to the discussion. And I'm quite sure that we come actually to these inspirational thoughts he gave to us. So we go ahead, we move to next actually to Frank. Frank will actually talk about helping the poor out of the poverty trap. Do's and don'ts in development cooperation. Frank, it's yours.
Thank you, Marcus, for the invitation. And it's a pleasure to be here. And also because we have been working with IFOAM since '91. I just looked back in our records, so it's 24 years. And just when you told me about Mucuna, at that time, 24 years ago, because I'm an agriculture engineer, I was working in Nicaragua with a movement called Campesino, which was promoting organic agriculture. And it was working with maize, intercropping Mucuna, with composting, with soil conservation. So it's all back again. So it never left. So, so I want to have this presentation from HIVOS. I will give you a bit of background about HIVOS, first see how this works. Yes. This presentation will be about sustainable diets for all, because this is the focus of the current program I'm working for at HIVOS. And it's especially a lobby and advocacy program, and it's trying to get all the actors in the world in the right direction and not in the wrong direction, what we've heard already too many times today, and which I shall repeat unfortunately again here, maybe in a different way. So first about HIVOS. So we are the Humanist Institute for Cooperation with Developing Countries. We have about 40 years experience working with Southern partners. We do a lot of different work, a lot of work also on organic farming, biodiversity, mobilizing farmers, supporting farmers, working with women. We work in many countries with 700 partners, and we used to have an income of 100 million euro a year, but this will be a little bit less, much less next year, because the Dutch government decided to cut down a lot on development cooperation. So we have to mobilize other donors and other funds working with others. So what do we do? We work with local civil society organizations in developing countries to work to create a free, fair and sustainable world. And we want all men and women to have equal access to opportunities for development. Well, what we heard a lot today, before this slide, I have 3 questions for you to get a little bit more dynamism from the public. So I want you to raise your hand on these 3 questions. You can raise your hand on all the 3 questions, that doesn't matter, but to have an idea about what makes you tick. So, do you think with sustainable development, firstly, is your main concern your own health or the health of your family or your children or your neighbors? Is that your main driver why you are here? Health. No, nobody is here for their own health concerns. Though I do agree with the earlier speaker that I think for many people this may be the trigger to get them personally involved. Are you here for the environment? So are you really concerned about the planet and that we need to protect the environment and nature? Yes? Or are you really here for the people? Are you really concerned about all those people not having a living income, in poverty, etc.? And of course there are multiple forces. So good. So I just wanted to get a feeling about the public here. I was expecting a little bit more people from outside of the expo, and then maybe the health question would have gotten more answers. So I will now go to some of the elements why we have such an unstable or unsustainable food system, and many of those. Sorry.
3 things are.
Of course they're connected, but
I don't even get the opportunity to challenge that.
But it's about the trigger which makes people move, which makes people tick. So what we see, there are these perverse incentives and power imbalance in the food system, leading to poor businesses and policies and practices. We saw in an earlier presentation about this triangle of power, that there's like a few companies, I think WWF estimated about 100, 200 companies. They are owner of about 70 or 80% of our food choices. So they are those big traders, big Walmarts, big McDonald's, etc., who decide about our food choices. And then there's so many producing consumers. So this is one of those perverse incentives. There's also the governance failure. We also heard about earlier today about the externalities, which are not being taken into account. And those are both social as well as environmental. This is very difficult, impossible for one country to have a legislation about it. The same with tax avoidance or subsidies. You cannot do that only in one country. You could do certain things, but it's difficult. Then we also see a lot of, this was also mentioned today by the FAO, that citizens are not aware and do not feel empowered to change the situation. Or citizens are aware, but they do not act as consumers, because in the supermarket they just go for the cheapest products. Or they're confused because there are so many labels, and what should I do? And they just go for the cheapest products. Then what we see often, especially in developing countries, that civil society, they lack the ability and the resource to play a strong watchdog role. In the Netherlands, and maybe it's happening in more developed countries, our government is focusing a lot on PPPs, on public-private partnerships. So the NGOs who now still get funding, they get funding to work together with private sector to work on innovation and solutions. I don't say that that's wrong, that can be a very valid, important role, but the watchdog function of civil society in the South is under pressure, also by certain governments in the South who are more repressive to NGOs. For example, in India, a lot of NGOs lost their status of being able to function in that country. And local research institutions are also under-resourced or often heavily politicized. And the media often cannot operate independently, so it's very difficult to get a campaign or action going on because the media is heavily influenced by, for example, the big multinationals who wants to who spends a lot of money in those media with advertising. So just to go back, and we heard it before, so I will be a bit quicker. What are the consumption issues? Well, we see that the food industry is promoting this global diet of processed foods. So my quote is Africa, so you can soon have obese giraffes. And at the same time, we have this monocropping of commercial crops replacing traditional diets, leading to more hidden hunger. For example, in Southern Africa, the government heavily promotes already for many years maize production. So a lot of farmers, they only produce maize, they only sell maize, and they are net food consumers because they don't grow anything else anymore on their plots. And you also see the shift, what we heard before today, towards more intensive meat and milk production. So what can the planet cope? And we heard this also before, is the public health threatened by the antibiotics, the pesticides, and the pathogens contaminating your food. So there are those big persistent problems, and we're really heading towards a big problem on the consumption part. On the consumption part, of course, then we have the climate change, where we heard Tim explaining a lot about it. Climate change, biodiversity loss, soil erosion, land grabbing, so many problems also on the production part in this world. And who's feeding the world? Those are still the peasants, the small-scale farmers. They still feed at least 70% of the world population. So those are still the backbone of our production part of the planet, and many of them women. So let's go to the goal of what the work we're now working for on HEVOS, and explain you that HEVOS used to work more on the production part. So that is our strength, to working with farmers on organic farming, biodiversity, promoting their rights, promoting their organization. We still continue with that, but we thought something is missing. There is a disconnection between the organizations working at the production part and those working at the consumption part. Because if you hear about consumption, it's mainly, or it's a bit elite, like, and I don't want to be rude, but the organic movement is still a bit elite, and it's not the fault of the organic movement, but it's just because it's more costly, it's more niche, it's more difficult to get. So, or those are people very much busy with nutrients, with micronutrients, with specific feeding for children, and I don't say anything wrong about that work, but we wanted to bring much more connection between the sustainable, healthy and affordable food agenda and the resilient, fair and fair production from the farmer side, which respects the environment. So the shift to sustainable diet is from the current production and consumption, move towards sustainable production and consumption. But how? That's the big question, and that's, I think, would be good to get more discussion also when we enter in the fishbowl discussion. So one of our work, what we're going to do, is this is our theory of change. So we work with the civil society organizations in the south, but also with northern, with allies, with research partners, consumer organizations, farmers organizations, and we work with them mainly to influence the public, the general public, through campaigns, through media, the governments and the private sector, to really change their policies and practices. You need to have good innovation, you need like evidence-based research, so you really can be powerful to show what works. You need to do campaigning, but you also need to work, what I put in the middle, and I will explain a little bit more further on, is working in these platforms, working in multi-stakeholder coalition, because the civil society alone, government alone, producer alone, private sector alone, you cannot do it. You need to do, on an equal basis, work together. So we work, these are the four main strategies we work on. So we still continue working, supporting and developing the CSO, the civil society organization capacity, on this topic of sustainable consumption and sustainable production. We want to get much more evidence-based policies and practices, investment, to really get a basis, trial and error, also making mistakes, but finding out, publishing about what works and what doesn't work. We want to organize campaigns and build public pressure on companies and governments. That's why I asked you about the health issues, because I know a lot of people everywhere in the world are concerned about their health. So if you get things about pesticides, about other things in their food, then they probably get mobilized much more quicker than when it's a faraway story somewhere of a poor person in the sourcing of your product. And last but not least is we want to work in those multi-stakeholder platforms, what I mentioned before. And it's important to learn from tradition. So this is something which inspires me a lot, and you still can find it back a little bit in Mexico, in Central America, if it's not being run over by big companies. But it's called the Three Sister cropping system, and this was in the same hole in native Indians. They grew a maize, a bean, and a squash. And those plants that were grown in the same hole, and they were very supporting each other. The maize grows big, the bean is giving nitrogen to the maize and grows into the maize without disturbing too much. And the squash likes a bit of humidity, so this squash covers the ground and lives and uses the places where the beans and the maize are not growing. And these crops together, they provide a very nutritious food, because they also combine it with lime from their garden. And the lime activates the protein from the legumes. So it was an excellent diverse production and diverse consumption on your plate. And what Nadia said from the FAO, I like that term, we need to re-indigenize. So we need to go back to some of the cultures in the different regions of the world. This diversity, it will enrich our culture, it will enrich the link with nature, and it will also enrich your nutrition. Well, another key strategy for us is women empowerment. Well, Tim already, I have the same phrase, so I will keep it short, so I maybe do more short than your presentation, but they produce at least half of the work, of the food in the world. And an investment in women, it gets back to their family and not to buying booze or other things. So it's very important to empower women, to ensure that they have land titles. That's a very big problem, because women often are not secure about their land, or they don't, or they have to get it from their husband or from the community. So land titles is very important for women. Training. We do this, what we call gender action learning. This is really integrated training with men and women, because if you only work with women, then you could get a problem with the men or in your families. But if you do a gender sensitization with men and women, it takes some time. But men at a certain moment also realize that they can do more things together with their wife, instead of fighting each other or living completely separately. So, and it can also be an inspiration for the children. And also how, especially the men, how they treat, for example, their daughters or the girls in the family. So this is an example of what we do. We have a lot of experience in this work, working in the coffee sector, which really helped to improve the coffee production. So then you can also convince roasters to join this work, and the farmers themselves, because they see it pays out. What are possible strategies? Well, change consumption, so shift to healthier diets, consumer awareness. I liked very much the suggestion about making the consumers much more aware about the actually cost of your food. So maybe we can start a campaign on that, the true price. We're already doing some calculation, the true price of flowers, the true price of tea. And if you could get some stamp on your product, well, this, for example, a beef steak, a piece of beef, that costs 3,000 liters of water. It's 60 times more than taking a shower. So by saving water, you shouldn't, well, you can always shower less, but it's much more effective to eat less meat. And then there's the urban food banks happening in, so the urban area is interesting. I'm a bit hesitant about what I saw before, was this whole thing about the vertical farming, because it's very technified and you lose all contact with soil, but there are possibilities much more at the urban level. Then, of course, at the change of production, well, we heard many people already talking about that, ecological intensification, fertility management, expand agriculture through the restoration of degraded land, because often those lands are abundant, but they can be revitalized, but they need additional investment. And that would be something very interesting from the green money from the EU, for example. And of course, farmer organizations innovate in adding value to existing production. So, and the last but not least, and this is the most complex one, is change the system. So reduce the food loss and waste, find kind of new, innovative ways to get people moving, to make them, get them into action. Promote organic, locally grown food, smallholder production, and women again are key in production and consumption. So try to do much more with women. And last but not least, 2 slides more, if it's okay. Just 2 examples how we work on those multi-stakeholder platforms, because for us it's very important, next to the campaigning part, awareness creation, it's also the multi-stakeholder approach is important for us. So for example, we work on grain-based landscape initiatives in different countries, in India, in Kenya, Zambia, and in Bolivia. In Bolivia, for example, it's about quinoa. And maybe you are all guilty also, because quinoa has become a hype. So everybody now started to eat quinoa. Prices, I think, doubled. The consequence, quinoa is a very healthy crop. We know it. The Bolivian used to eat it. But now what's happening in Bolivia is that the production area got doubled. And it's getting exhausted, because quinoa is a good crop for human, but if you don't replenish the soil, it takes too much away from the soil. And the people, the Bolivians, they cannot eat quinoa anymore. They have to go to processed food or other stuff because it's too expensive. So we started a platform in this area where they grow quinoa with a lot of different stakeholders to see, well, what is the real problem and how can we tackle it? Looking both at the production part as well as the local consumption part. And another innovation what we do is the food change labs, and that's the same kind of way. We get innovative groups together, and this can also be creative, it can be journalists. We work with the mayor of a small city, but growing city in Uganda, who is very concerned about the food security, food vendors, cooks. So you can bring in a very unusual coalition of people and then really do something. So not having these endless shops, but really start in the innovation and find something which is kind of appealing for business, for government, and for the producers and consumers. Thank you. That was my presentation.
Thank you, Frank. Thank you very much. I think you were boosting very much Tim's presentation, looking into very much from a systems view, and honestly, I understand now much more why we are so close, actually, institutionally also. Thank you very much, Frank, for this. Is there a burning question to Frank? If this is not the case, then I would suggest that we go ahead with Christopher's presentation, our last presentation today. Christopher, you talked about organic as a source for solutions. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thanks very much for the invitation to speak here, because for me this is a really fascinating context at Expo 2015, and I'm going to reflect a little bit more on that in a little while. First, briefly about IFOAM European Regional Group. We are one of the regional groups under the umbrella of IFOAM Organics International, and we have a specific interest, obviously, it comes with our name, in the European context. From that point of view, it's quite important, I think, particularly following from the last 2 speakers, to reflect on the fact that there are big tensions between the global north, represented by Europe, and the global south. And I think from that point of view, we need to acknowledge that organic farming and food's relevance varies substantially around the world between the global north and the global south. And if we think about the 50% of the world's food producers that ensure food security as far as they can, they're peasant farmers working on a small scale without the access to the resources that are involved in industrial agriculture. And in that sense, you could say they're organic by default. Now, if you think about the work that Tim has been doing in the African continent, he has helped organic by default farming systems to achieve a level of agroecological... Sorry, have I been really hard to hear? Apologies to the translators. He's helped those organic by default farmers achieve a level of agroecological intensification, in other words, working from within their own resources, and achieve significant increases in yield. That situation, in a different way, also obtains in Europe. If you think in the European Union there are 28 member states, from the north to the south, from the east to the west. We heard earlier on that Romania has 50% of all of Europe's small farms under 5 hectares. So reflect on that global diversity between the global north and the global south, and reflect on that regional diversity within Europe between the north, the south and the east and the west. Different systems, different practices. Now if we're thinking about what organic has to offer by way of solving that massive problem of global hunger, we need to, at the outset, put on one side the fact that we can't deal with some of the most intractable problems that have led to the problem of global hunger and persist in getting worse. And from that point of view, first and foremost, we need to acknowledge that poverty is the root of hunger, not a failure of production. We need to acknowledge, as already has been ably demonstrated by the 2 previous speakers, that gender is a critical issue, and without understanding and solving issues to do with gender, there's nothing we can do. And finally, that equity of access to resources is absolutely central. Now, within those 3, alleviating poverty, solving gender deficits, if you like, deficits of equity generally in relation to access to resources and of women specifically, population clearly comes as an overarching issue, which again is out of our control. If we were to successfully alleviate poverty, we would successfully reduce population growth, and we would therefore also potentially empower women, since women's control of their own fertility is perhaps one of the most important things in enabling a reduction in the rapid growth of population. So, put those on one side. Those are the reasons why the world is hungry, and those are the things that organic can't do anything about. But what can organic do something about? I would say it really can show leadership in the fact that there is a viable alternative. There are different ways of producing food. But of course then we also need to acknowledge and recognise that the consumption patterns are at the heart of the problem. Who is driving consumption patterns? It's other hidden interests, not controlled by government, by civil society organisations, by campaigners, but by corporations putting in front of people food that is apparently attractive to them. Now we can't challenge that consumption paradigm, but we can show leadership, and I would say that if you look at organic consumers, typically they will eschew, they will reject the products of intensive and fast food. And increasingly, if we can encourage more people to think in an organic way, we can get more effective resolution of the consumption challenge, which we are all painfully aware of. And as we saw with Antonio's table, his consumption pattern matches the productive capacity that is possible with organic farming systems. Now, one of the things, so I'm saying that organic can show leadership because we have viable alternatives. What are those viable alternatives rooted in? For me, one of the most important features of the organic system is the way it respects and works with diversity. We've heard that several times already in the session today. And I think that diversity is absolutely critical to an effective, fair, equitable food and farming system. If you put and reflect briefly on your entry into the expo, what you saw coming out that central aisle was an immense diversity, a wealth of cultures, of individual nation states putting forward their proposition for the best possible food. Now, I didn't notice that many people proposing that there were 3 primary commodity crops that world hunger alleviation depends upon. of pork bellies, of maize, of soya. I saw every one of those countries putting forward proudly a diverse food culture, which actually is largely disassociated, isn't connected with those commodity products that are the stuff of global corporations. And from that point of view, then, diversity links to scale. Because if, as you walk up there, you see many, many small companies, and what's interesting, what I was expecting to see at Expo 2015 was a display of corporate power. But actually, one of the biggest corporations had a rather small stand. It was McDonald's. It hasn't been pumping itself full. Coca-Cola is a sponsor of Expo 2015. But actually what's shown isn't heavily sweetened drinks based upon the sugar that's extracted from... Sorry?
Put it up again. Once again up.
Who was it? Oh, no, I'm not going to be advertising to McDonald's. You must be joking.
That's another thing.
So I'm definitely not going to hold that up again for you to take a picture of that. You'll use it against me almost certainly. So then, coming from issues of scale and diversity, then I think we can start to define what we mean by true sustainability. And I would say in this audience, we have a significant level of agreement. I would say in civil society organisations, we have a significant level of agreement. I would have said with the 20 million people that have visited Expo 2015 this year, we have a significant level of agreement. And that is that we want to have interesting, culturally diverse food. We want to enable women to take their true place in society. We want to control population, but we don't want to depend on McDonald's. We don't want to depend on Monsanto. And that's all to do with scale. And the tendency, which has damaged the world so much, has been for power to concentrate in fewer and fewer hands. Again, that's not something the organic movement can do anything about, apart from to show leadership and that there is an alternative. So true sustainability for me involves the three pillars of ecology/environment, social and economic sustainability. There's been a tendency for a focus only on economic sustainability, and that has enabled polluting corporations to grow at the expense of humanity and the environment. What we do need is scale on a diverse level, which would enable a range of different foods to be offered all over the world in structures that are smaller and more accessible. And to finish, actually, I would like to then return thinking about the importance of organic as offering an alternative model for production and the challenge that we also need to deal with consumption, to think about where innovation comes from and what innovation is. And I would say there's a tendency for the organic sector to see itself as focusing primarily on the way we grow our food, but we also need to think, and innovating, therefore, and as explained by Tim and by others also, but we also need to think about the food we eat. It's a consumption issue. We need to enter that territory and innovate to find ways to solve the consumption problem. And also, at an even higher level, we need to think about the way we live our lives. And I would have said, again, the people here, the people out there, largely are changing and thinking about the way they live their lives. We need to redouble our efforts to show that we can live an ecologically balanced life, and that one of the first steps in that is dealing with the way we produce our food. Of course, also we need to think about the way we build our houses, the way we move around, indeed the very need to move around. So food is only one part of our activity, but it's in a sense, along with shelter and clothing, one of the most fundamental needs, because if we're without food, we will only last, well, longer than you might imagine, but not that long at all. So innovation is about balancing the effort of research and development to move in the direction and support developments that are at a human scale, enabling diversity and concentrating and focusing specifically on issues of the global south. And so from that point of view then, research and development expenditure is massively outweighed for those that have the interests of capital and profit at their heart, rather than the food security and quality. And from that point of view, we need to think about that immense spend by companies like McDonald's and Monsanto, not here at Expo 2015, but look at the lobbying power that they exert in the European Union, in the United States of America. Think about the Transatlantic Trade Investment Partnership and the consequences of that, driven by global corporations. So although research and development can help and provide innovations in the way we grow our food, we also need to innovate in the food we eat and the way we live our lives. And I believe that's part of the responsibility of the organic movement to take on board and work very actively within. And thank you very much for listening to my brief rant. I will now go and ceremoniously stamp conclusively on the McDonald's balloon.
Thank you, Christopher. Thanks a lot. Well, yeah, you remind us actually about our roles. You go actually back to our strengths and values, and you link actually excellently with the session tomorrow, which you will moderate also, Organics 3.0. I think it links a lot actually with reminding ourselves what we're supposed to do. Thanks a lot, Christopher. Is there a burning question to Christopher? You see that I'm speeding up a little bit, and I would like to invite you actually here to our fishbowl. Come closer, and yes, we will have the opportunity to react to each other's sessions, to each other's presentations, to each other's messages. Can we have you, Christopher? So let me quickly remind you to the rules of the game. We have here chairs and speakers, and we have more chairs than speakers. That means you're most welcome and invited actually to join the discussion, to join the debate, to be part actually of us, and to discuss with us here. What we do right now is actually first to look at each other's presentations. We will have first a reflection from Antonio on these presentations, and then this will actually empower the discussion among you. And then we go back to our concept, which we initially started, and look at two more short movies, which you can have deeper than I told you already. We look at local food system, and we look at science and tech. But first of all, Antonio, the floor is yours. And maybe Christopher, you just remove the paper there to welcome people to join. Jacqueline is already part of the round. Welcome.
Okay. Very briefly, I was impressed by your presentation, Tim, and I reminded me when I first went to Africa, so often, but once was my first IFO conference in 1989 at Ouagadougou. And that was an incredible time because Sankara just died, unfortunately, but he was promoting compost and organic, and it was like, yeah, oh, they are really serious in that direction. But that was not in the agenda of many groups that they maybe find better ways to sell fertilizer and say they need fertilizer. We bring fertilizer to them. And I had my friend Ettore Tibaldi, was an Italian at that conference that unfortunately died a few years ago. And he was there trying to keep the desert out with compost and planting and things like that back in 1989. Again, I think making a connection on what you just said, you just open up the discussion about urban agriculture and also what you've been talking about the strategy and how to cope. I think one barrier that we didn't talk about today at the beginning of the first session is that we have already, I think in the last 2 years, most of the people are living inside cities. That's something. I mean, we had, okay, I'm coming from a small country, Italy, that is maybe populated for many, many years, and we have a lot of scattered settlements everywhere. And so it's different than the US or Australia or other places where you have huge distances between cities. That gives you, but it gives, I mean, we also been experiencing for many years the urban development, you know, concrete taking away incredible fertile land, because normally when there are settlements there where people could make food, and they were taken away, they were being taken away. And especially in a country like Italy, we have not really hard things to sell, but our landscape, culture, and food, and then they were taking away this, making awful buildings, growing too much roads and so on, and taking away railways and putting roads for the car industry, and so on. Now we are experiencing a crisis that is still hitting quite hard in Italy, but not only, a lot of Southern Europe. We have this global South and global North, but I see that there is some change of the cardinal ways. I mean, it's not so easy. I mean, you find a lot of South in the North and some North in the South. So it's not so easy in black and white in the story, especially in the Southern Mediterranean European countries. But out of this crisis, I see at least there are some opportunities. One is, for example, that a lot of land that used to be agricultural land, because of this speculation and thinking, oh, I got money. I mean, the same story that happened in the US many years ago, but it happened in Italy. And you have a lot of those building areas that used to be agriculture, but people have to, and nobody's building anymore because there is a crisis, nobody's buying, there's too much houses actually, and so what happens? People have to pay tax because it's a urban area, and now they want to switch back to agriculture land. And that is an incredible opportunity at our local level, because that is at the territorial level, in municipality. And we've been talking, for example, with our minister in the Emilia-Romagna region to try to drive this in a way that, yes, we give you back as agriculture, but you have to commit to give this land for long-term rent for unemployed young people, or young and old, going organic, and rebuilding a supply chain, a shared supply chain that was the bone of our civilization, let's say, everywhere. People were used to grow locally. You didn't have freighters or big ships bringing food all around the world. And this, I think, is the solution. Yeah, no, just finish. That I think that is something we need to tackle. How to rebuild this connection with local food and urban, maybe moving back to the countryside and the people living in the cities.
Okay, who wants to react on Antonio or on the other presentations? Frank,
yeah, maybe just very quick on this local, because I just came back from Kenya like 1 month ago, and I was surprised by like two trends that are kind of opposite trend. One was a partner we're supporting there. They're promoting use more indigenous vegetables, which was really getting on with the urban people. You know, because it wasn't lost yet. They were not eating it anymore, but it was easy to reestablish. So even with supermarkets and promotions, so they started to using many more local vegetables, green leaves, which are very healthy, nutritious, and they used to be part of the staple food in the rural area. So
battery gone. Bring another one.
Antonio, you used up the battery of the mic.
And the second one is that they also introduce of those hybrid chicken, you know, those horrible Kentucky Fried Chicken who can hardly walk, but also indigenous chickens where more value. So there's still appreciation in Kenya, in Nairobi. So that they pay like 30% more for this more organically growing indigenous chicken. So there is like, it's not the bottom of the, you know, the poorest of the poor, but it's also not elite. So there is like this possibilities to work in using more local, more traditional, more healthy food also in urban situations in the south.
A quick comment back to your comment about way back when in Africa, and you saw still the push for fertilizer. Just a couple of years ago, they had the first ever continent-wide discussion on no-till conservation agriculture, and there were so many NGOs. It's not just the Gates Foundation, it's not just the Rockefeller Foundation. but so many that were committed to fertilizer and getting fertilizer everywhere. And this is in a continent where there often is not the infrastructure, the people can't afford it, and governments cannot continue to subsidize it, and there's certainly not a knowledge base around the fact of how degrading it is to the environment and the soil. But understand, we in the first world, in the global south, north, is pushing this chemical addiction, destructive addiction in the south. And this is a consciousness and discussion we all need to responsibly engage, I think, on a very broad level.
First thing is acknowledging the cities issue. Briefly, yes, it's a real difficulty, I think, for on the consumption side, is that concentration. But there are two questions. There are two questions I wanted to put to Tim. One to Tim, one to Frank. And to Tim, I wanted to understand your use of the term regenerative organic. I understand organic by the standards to be essentially regenerative. Is it somehow very different? And I know where you may be coming from on that. And the question to Frank is that HIVOS, you referred to as a humanist organisation. I personally am a humanist. I'm not a believer in a higher entity. What? I've also been intrigued and also driven by faith-based ideas around food and have an immense amount of respect for faith as a humanist and a spiritual sort of dimension. So what does HIVOS do to relate to the faith-based populations, which represent a very significant part of the world? So are you humanistic in the way that you do your work, in a sense therefore denying the importance and relevance of faith? Or as a humanist, can you work with faith traditions which have a lot to say about stewardship, about care for animals, about care for each other, very important things about equity? They also say some really bad things about women and a number of other things as well. But if you take the good out of faith, can HIVOS do something to work with that, even as a humanist organisation?
Okay, 2 questions, 2 reactions.
Okay, quickly a response on regenerative organic. I am distinguishing, yes, between organic, at least in the United States, that can slip by as high input systems that do not build soils whatsoever. As a matter of fact, can still be extractive within those soils. And so unless, because part of the point that I was making is we're losing soils, we're losing fertility, and we're losing carbon into the atmosphere by the way we farm, unless it's regenerative by intention, that it's going to build the soil carbon, the organic matter, the biology, it is not going to be helpful towards any kind of future. We have no future. So we have a National Organic Standard Board that will let you get away, in the United States at least, is a high input organic system, which is not regenerative at all.
I would have said then, therefore, with the equivalence agreement between the EU and North America, it's clearly completely wrong. And I think whenever you refer to the importance of regenerative, admit the fact that the National Organic Programme and NOSB standards aren't effectively regenerative, and don't tar European organic farms with the same brush, because the European regulation is relatively clear on the importance of rotation, including the fertility building phase. So I think you must make sure that you kick the Americans, don't kick us.
I appreciate that. I'm not kicking you, but I'm saying globally, because in essence, and I am, stand up Americans, I'll kick you. It's important. I'll tell you, that's a problem in the United States. It's a real problem, one that we're greatly concerned about. But I'd also monitor your carbon, because rotation often isn't enough. It is not enough for where we need to go.
Yeah, just quickly on the humanist part, it's all about values. So a lot of faith-based organizations, they have the same values. I mean, we are all humans, so that's where humanists come from. So we work in Latin America with organizations formed by the liberation theology. So they are not rigid. So we have a problem as a humanist organization more with the power structures with some of the religious faith-based organizations. So, but when we started 40 years ago, Holland was still very much faith-based. So you had the Protestant organization, you had the Catholic one, and you had one more socialist. And so then then HIVOS was set up to be something different. But there's, at least in Holland, it has become much more merged.
Okay, thank you. And I think now it's time for Jacqueline.
I would like to congratulate you. I think that you're already a bunch of great guys. Very interesting presentation, and maybe you were asking if we were here for health, environment, or social. You did. If you would have said diet rather than health, I would have said yes. Why? Because of course I'm a mother, so I had to raise children, I had to feed them, and if the public would have been composed of more young people, they would also have said yes. Because I think younger people nowadays are much more aware of diets than what our generation was when we were young, and I think that's very good. And if you would have asked happiness, I would also have raised my hand, and I think the young people would also have raised their hands, because if you look at the trends with the social medias from the south to the north, the east to the west, the young people have a very strong claim to express themselves, and they have a claim to happiness, but they also have a claim to justice. Young people don't really agree anymore that people are being exploited, and that people have shitty jobs and they have not the same opportunities as they have eventually. It's just that maybe they don't have yet the movement or maybe the avenue in which they can express those things. But I think a lot of things are going on that we are not grasping yet, because it's not yet there. It doesn't demonstrate itself so well. But it does demonstrate in one thing. And I was really, really surprised this afternoon when I went to the presentation, the symposium that was organized by FIBO about the food smart cities for development. And I think that's where we are really, really going to have the allies of millions of peoples worldwide. Because if you look at the cities that were signing that chart, they are from all over the world, from Europe, from the African continent, Asia, and the American continent. And there I really put a lot of hope, because the city people are the ones that are also the educated people. At the same time, it's also the most marginalized. At the same time, it's the one that need good nutrition, and very often they don't have good nutrition. So it's all of the above. So I think vary with your consumption, production, storage, what Anna said earlier of FAO, the question of storage. For me, it's not so much storage, it's maybe more the way of we do trade more than storage. It's more trade, the problem that we are facing. But there's one thing I haven't heard of nobody today, is that the financial markets, you mentioned the multinational companies, but honestly, it's not the multinational companies that are the bad guys. Because the multinational companies are anonymous societies. Those are the shareholders, and the shareholders and the stock exchanges, the financial markets, those are the real culprits. And nobody is talking about that. And I think that's where we really, really have one of the biggest threats. If we can find a solution to put some straitjackets around the financial markets, to control them better, and to stop this crazy, crazy dynamic of them, that's one challenge I think we have to face. And the other one is that people still up to now do not put in question that the whole world is being driven what is happening at the stock exchange. And if you look at the UN pavilion, it stopped. The presentation of the UN pavilion basically stopped with the question of the stock exchanges, and it's very intelligent, but nobody is doing anything. So do you have any take on this? That's what I would like to hear from you, smart brain.
Okay, small reaction. I see you think, raise the hand.
I said something about maybe you were not there. When the big corporation, the shareholders are pension funds. In a way, it's also theoretically us. And I think the solution, I mean, you're totally right. We need to have a more ethical way of financing. And this is also up to us to change our behavior and not put our little money, if we have, or to anything, just looking at the profit. We need to have something, some organization, and there are, some of them are even engaged inside organic. One of my organization stakeholders is the Ethic Bank, but there is 3 others, there are others, there is a network of, because if we don't start on putting the money, maybe you don't get the same interest rate, but at least you're not the culprit, you're not to be blamed, to be part of the system.
I've thought a lot about that question over the years, because when you look at the suffering that occurs in the world, the poverty, the inaccessibility to opportunity for many people, and then you look at our capitalistic system that now dominates the globe, and our corporatism and our corporatocracies, and you look at the financial system, and you say, what adjustments can you make? It's a model that can't really be adjusted. You can regulate it a little bit, you can fine-tune a little bit, but it is completely disconnected by design from the environment. It has no linkage to the environment. It only exploits and destroys it. So it puts us in a paradigmatic shift challenge that's bigger than most people want to wrestle with. And it is, heretical to most all conversations. So maybe if you want to buy a drink later, we'll talk about it. But now this is a big question that I've thought a lot about, and it's a huge shift. It needs to go.
Well, two reactions. One is that there are organizations creating more awareness about it. So I used to work for Oxfam, and they work with the Ethical Bank Guide. It started in Holland, but rolling out to several other countries, not yet the UK and the US, so the big ones, but also to Indonesia, Brazil. So this is about creating more awareness about what's happening with your money on the bank, but also your pension funds, because we also look at the pension funds. So that's one thing. The other one is there are investors taking account on it, because I heard a very interesting business, something I like to watch in the car, those business programs. You get a different kind of focus. And this was somebody explaining why he didn't have Coca-Cola in his portfolio, but he did have PepsiCo. It was mainly because Coca-Cola is so vulnerable. They only have sugary drinks. So he was saying, well, this is a very vulnerable business model. So that's one thing. But also the investors, and this is the difference between the long-term investors or the sharks. They look at the future, so they really look at trends and sustainability issues, because otherwise they invest in something which like oil, something which will go down at a certain moment. So there is this possibility, not only with the smaller kind of triodos investors, which is kind of logical to work with, but some of the big ones, they can be convinced on those type of arguments.
Okay. Yeah, just very briefly to say that, of course, one of the things that the financial markets became more and more involved in was food and trading in commodities. And that's something that only happened relatively recently as a result of a change in some regulation, which I forget now. And that change has led to that monumental speculation on food, which has had immense disruptive impacts on the food system. But even if you put that on one side, they're all sharks and should be abolished and stamped on like McDonald's blue.
Thank you. Let's break here the discussion for the time being here, and I would like to go now to our last movie, where we look at the local food system. Can I have movie number 7, please? Seven.
Local food systems can help us overcome this problem. Many argue that because modern farms use a lot of energy and cause a lot of pollution, that our food systems will prove unable to meet the rising demands of the global population. These arguments go like this. Today, a handful of large corporations control the vast majority of the world's food trade. In doing so, they make a huge amount of money by using farming systems that damage the environment, exploit workers, and displace traditional farmers. By contrast, food systems based on local, diverse, and small farms that use few chemical inputs like pesticides or fertilizers are more sustainable, equitable, and democratic. This is because when producers and consumers know each other and interact, then the entire community has a say in how food is produced. This should mean that farmers receive a decent income, since they will receive a higher percentage of the value of the food they produce. And they should also protect the environment better, because consumers will be okay with paying more for food they know isn't covered with polluting sprays. Also, because food is produced and consumed in the same region, the amount of fossil fuels burned for transportation should go down. Goodbye processed cheese and vegetables from the Southern Hemisphere. And hello locally produced seasonal dishes. Those of us in the rich parts of the world probably associate these ideas with the 100-mile diet. In the developing world, these ideas are often described as food sovereignty and are promoted by La Via Campesina, an international movement advocating that consumers and small-scale producers work together to take control of their food. Many, however, question whether this vision of alternative food systems can provide a viable food security strategy for humanity's growing population. For instance, while there is a huge disagreement among scientists, many point out that farms using alternative methods tend to have lower yields when compared with conventional farms. This means that many scientists worry that if we're going to feed a growing population using the alternative farming practices promoted by the local food movement, we'll either need more farmland or we'll have to find ways of cutting down on our consumption and waste. A second common criticism leveled against the promoters of alternative food systems is that whenever alternative farms try to grow bigger, they end up looking just like conventional farms. But do these criticisms mean alternative local food systems have no place in the 21st century? I don't think so. Even if local alternative food systems don't feed all of us all of the time, it doesn't mean that there is no role for such systems as a component of a secure and resilient food security strategy. Local alternative systems add diversity to our farming landscapes, and diversity is very important because alternative farming practices often provide the template to help improve the design of more mainstream systems. Alternative food systems, especially in poor regions of the world, provide a buffer between consumers and the volatility of the international market, while also empowering people by giving them some control over their food. Finally, having local farms integrated into the fabric of urban life connects city dwellers with their food, making them more aware of the ecosystems on which we all depend. They provide habitat for wildlife, they trap stormwater before it damages people's homes, and they should be beautiful. Therefore, my own reading of the debate around alternative farming systems tells me that to be sustainable, we must support local food systems that use alternative agricultural practices. We need to do this as consumers as well as through policy that should foster local food systems by making sure farmers have access to processing facilities and markets. But we must also realize that local and alternative won't feed us all. We'll be relying on conventional farming systems that produce huge amounts of food in the world's bread baskets for the foreseeable future, albeit with high fossil fuel inputs. So what we need is a balanced approach. Our food security will be enhanced if all of us are able to draw from both global and local systems. This video looks at how strong local food systems can help us overcome this problem. Many argue that because modern farms use a lot of energy and cause a lot of pollution, that our food systems will prove unable to meet the rising demands.
Please come back. Please come back. So I saved the maybe most controversial issue for the end. You see a position expressed. Antonio also want to join. You see a position expressed by the author of this video, and I would like to see your reaction actually to that. Whether you see that as agreeable, or how you react to the question, which eventually goes back, can organic feed the world? And it was like Antonio, if the first opportunity as an initiator of the Action Network. Address that.
I keep it short. I like global, meaning that it's impossible not to think, not exactly the same idea of the guy that wrote the sketch. We should strengthen as much as we can, for the reason that's been stated, the informal and local markets, and try to change the dynamics of the global trade. Trade of food has been there everywhere, from ages. The Greek, they were buying the figs from the Egyptian because they were earlier than theirs. And I think that this kind of trade should be there, but there should be more awareness and more sustainability and more organic in very few words. And I think we need also to change our diets. That is not written here, but is part of the game.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, coming from a perspective of actually seeing the effects of climate change and overreach, overshoot, and now as I said, 150% of where we are, our backs are more than against the wall as a civilization. And psychologically, we defend ourselves against the reality of those numbers, the reality of what's going on with climate. We defend ourselves against accepting the fact that we have overshot. If you look at conventional farming systems, it is, instead of a regenerative system, it's a degenerative system. It continues the overshoot. So it isn't even a possibility to go forward that way. Will we? Likely we will, to our own demise. But it is not a possibility that when we talk about food security, that's a short-sighted view. You have to take the long-range view from an atmospheric standpoint, from what's getting released into the waterways, and how those are being destroyed, and how much demand for water those soils are going to create because they're lacking the organic matter to hold the moisture and to percolate the water during the rain. So it is an unreal discussion in this film, from my experience, from the data, and if you look long range. It is not the future, Marcus, and a regenerative organic is the only one. That we're really building soils rapidly, not slowly, not over time, not just with crop rotation, but everything from cover crops, the right kinds of multiple species plantings, the composting, and rotating deep-rooted pastures through the farming system that will replace more soil carbon than any other method that can be brought into the system as a whole.
Right, I think you refer to the title of the session, sustainably or not at all. Just in different words, but still the question you have an answer. If you go that path, do we have enough production? That's the question which we are asked all the time.
Inorganic. Oh, we can have surplus, because if I will go in and where is 1 in 4 of the hungry going to be in Africa? By your sign back here. So if you go into Africa and you say, where are the hungry? Well, the majority of them live rurally. The majority of them have land. What happens there is they have tired and poor soils. This is not going to be, it can be replaced short-term with fertilizer, but in many cases the soils are so tired and so poor on soil carbon that the fertilizers won't even make a difference. And the only way forward is in the regenerative organic systems. And that's not just sustainable, it's regenerative, but it's the only way in some ways they're going to get those yield increases. So my answer is, organic not only could, it is actually the only way to move forward.
I agree, but it would mean a completely revalidation of food, because then it would be a huge investment in Africa to get this organic, because it will not come in one day. So it will be a huge investment, so it would mean that we would pay more for food, and that the food becomes more of an essential part. So that's so I don't know, there is always this kind of harmony model, so we continue with the large scale and we slowly build up the organic kind of local source movement. Or there's people, I'm an optimistic person, but often and I have kids, but often I'm a bit afraid that we may only change based upon a bigger conflict. And more migrants coming in, more problems, more climate change, etc. I don't hope we go that way, but usually humanity is only learning from this kind of big disaster, so I don't hope we go that way. But, yeah.
Christoph.
Thanks very much. I think for me, actually the point that Frank made was particularly important. I think that the potential is there for a seismic shift, where we will be put, if you like, on a war footing. And so during the Second World War, with a much smaller population and really quite well-adjusted food systems, relatively speaking, intensively produced white meat was banned overnight. Quite simple. So essentially, when the chips are down and the food has to go to humans, we will just ban Kentucky Fried Chicken. You could say let's work in advance and, like with the banks, let's find some way of recapitalising them. Kentucky Fried Chicken has a market cap value of around 8 billion euros, something like that, maybe more now. Let's just buy them off and say this is a broken model. Of course we won't do that. And so I think the point we need to respect in the cartoon was there's an issue of transition. And clearly during a phase when organic moves towards being more mainstream, there will continue to be exports of the commodity crops. The thing I took exception to, and the thing I want to finish on, is the fact that people don't live by bread alone. And of course those commodity crops that are internationally traded are relatively a small part of the diverse and interesting diet of people that have what they deserve, which is a diverse and interesting diet. However important bread is as part of that. It's not so the implication in the film and the cartoon was that unless we enable trade to continue of commodity crops, then we'll starve. Actually, commodity crops don't do much for that, although clearly wheat and rice are important. Witness the problems in 2008. So we need to, I think, look at a transition, which will involve some, but actually the focus on trade should be on what we want to have to make our food immensely pleasurable. I'm a very keen foodie and cook, and for me, the blandness of cabbage of 40 years ago can be enlivened to a fascinating dish every day of the week, very different, as long as you've got some spices, as long as you've got lemons, as long as you've got olive oil. So from that point of view, you could slash trade to about 1/100th of its current volume and focus only on those things, as is used by these, all of the stands around Expo 2015, use it to enliven culturally interesting and sensorically pleasurable foods at the table, which are eaten by real people. So we do want trade of food that makes food exciting. We don't need long-term that trade of commodities, they do nothing for anybody. And if we were on a war footing, they'll be banned overnight anyway. And that will happen. I can't see it not happening. Maybe not actually in my lifetime, but pretty soon after it's not the right, it can't be done.
Thank you, Christopher. Now we have a guest here now around.
Thank you. My name is Rose Hogan and I work for Trócaire. I'm an animist, but I work for a Catholic organisation. The first point I'd like to make is about the points that have just been made, and there's an expert called Eric Old-Jimenez who basically says that you can't have the large-scale monoculture, conventional agriculture being promoted as a solution to food security alongside the small-scale farmers, because it's actually eating up the small-scale farmers all over the world. And I mean, one example of it is how our governments are involved in agreements with southern governments around promoting opportunities for commercial agriculture within those countries. Malawi, Ethiopia, for example, they have these framework agreements under the Global Alliance for Food Security, not to be confused with the Global Alliance for Future Food, which is quite a different philanthropic thing. But basically, under those agreements, the governments have made agreements to open up their export of commodities like maize, where they have put in moratoria in order to try and have good food stocks and avoid famines. They've also been forced to open up their patenting laws, and they have allocated big areas of land that are available to these large-scale investors. For instance, in Ethiopia, it's something like 250,000 hectares. So I don't know if I'm allowed to keep speaking. I have a few other points. And I mean, I've very much enjoyed everything everyone is saying here, because sometimes, as the only agricultural advisor in an organisation that works globally, and I'm a sustainable agriculture advisor, it's very hard to not feel lonely, because you're also trying to put people in your own organisation who are working on rights, sometimes land rights, but still don't understand about the actual nuances about diversity and about diversity of land ownership and all of that. But anyway, it's been wonderful hearing you all. And my first point, I suppose, is to Tim, but it's to everyone. And we had, it was either this morning or yesterday, we had this discussion about the language we're using and all the different terms. And it becomes really confusing in the production side as well as in the marketing and labelling side. And I would dearly ask Tim not to use the term conservation agriculture anymore, because I have stood in a field in Malawi watching a little child with a saucepan taking water out of an irrigation channel and listening to the community group telling me how wonderful conservation agriculture was. And then I'm thinking, oh boy, this is great, they're doing great things. And I said, well, why is it wonderful? And a woman stood up and she said, because I don't have to work so hard. And I said, and why? Because of the Roundup. So, Monsanto, that calls itself the National Seed Company in Malawi, is in there in deals with organisations like USAID, Bill Gates Foundation, Irish Aid, UK Aid, and even Concern Worldwide, trading its goods under such headings. We're now moving into this climate smart agriculture term, and the FAO, Nadia isn't here, but basically they seem to have a lot of money for discussion and networks, and I belong to that network. I belong to the Conservation Agriculture Network as well, but they're trading their goods still there. There's this whole greenwashing going on that it's very, very hard to navigate for an ordinary consumer. And so I think, anyway, I try to explain it to the people I work with in 14 different countries, and it's very, very difficult.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we are having come to a moment when we have started with the story of Antonio's food. We have ended with a story, actually a story of that person praising conservation agriculture. And I think I would like to conclude here, giving each of you one more opportunity to reflect a little bit and to get an overall view of what we have done today. Because we have said actually that the food of the future has to be sustainable or not at all. You use the term regenerative or not at all. I think there we are probably in the small detail. We have touched many issues. We have touched actually issues of governance, regulation. We have touched issues of science and tech innovations. We have touched issues of distribution, and we have touched issues of local food systems. All this shows actually complexity, it shows diversity, it shows actually how that we have to move forward, not with blueprint solution, not with simple solution, that we go forward actually in system thinking and in a strategic alliance, which we move forward slowly, not from one day to another, but on a long-term perspective. And I think that's all embraced in the session today. We have all touched upon. And I think we can't repeat, we can't summarize, we can just reflect a little. And for that, I would like to give each of you a last opportunity. Who wants to make a start? I think Antonio should be last.
Well, I want to keep it short because so many things were mentioned. What I think is very important is to work much more also together in this group and with other people on monitoring those external social and environmental costs. I think that's very important because it can help you to create awareness with consumers, with the public, who can then influence companies. It can help you, at a certain moment it could help on regulation. It can also happen with the financial sector, because if they are more and more aware what are the costs of their, the negative cost of their investment, they're also both under pressure, under public pressure, but also for the long term they will also look if it still makes business sense. So for me, we were already, as HIVOS, we are already working on that, the true price of products, but I think it's because you can also compare it with organic food. And then I hope and I assume, and I know almost for sure that the cost will be much lower because you don't have so much harm on your environment and your social cost. So you can also compare what is now the current organic cost in the shop compared with a conventional product, and then add up those extra costs. So that's both my homework, but also I think it's an effective strategy. So I just name one.
I can't back away from the fact that if we look at where we are climate-wise, that we're within a decade or so of maybe the point of no return. So we are more than our back against the wall. And so regenerative, the reason I use that in an organic sense is that, and actually Bob Rodale used that when he was in Africa in the 80s, regenerative. It's about building systems, ecosystems, and that's really, really crucial. And the reason we can be critical of conservation agriculture being stolen, co-opted by Monsanto, so has sustainability. For that word to be used here is to help Monsanto with their agenda, as conservation agriculture can sometimes help them with their agenda. But I think the point, when we think in terms of regenerative, we have to take the components out of the basic principles of conservation agriculture, which is minimum soil disturbance, always keeping the ground covered, and rotations. And that's about building systems. And there's nothing in there about Roundup, but it's a term that's been co-opted. So don't use the term, but how do we rebuild? And how do we take that carbon out of the atmosphere, hold the soil in place and not disturb the aggregation, and emit more carbon when we kill it back into the atmosphere? And those are the challenges that we all now face. And our food system can help drive this. Our food system can help save us from this cataclysmic cliff that we're stepping over very, very rapidly. And so I can't look at trends in the long term, because I don't think science tells us we have a long term. And we have the challenge, we have the solution, and now how do we incentivize and motivate and speed the process up? And we're sitting here with the right knowledge today and knowing how to do it. And I encourage us to continue to engage it every single day with our full heart and our full passion.
Thanks, Tim. Interesting, actually, both Frank and Tim mentioned the two things that I've highlighted that I've missed out to say. So I'll just reiterate them. True cost accounting, or its other side, which is true value pricing, and I think it's interesting to think of the two as different ways, different sides of the same coin. And the other thing is about system thinking, whole systems, as Tim just mentioned, and the significance of systemic thinking compared to linear input-output type models, and the role and relevance of cycles, which comes back to Tim's point about regenerative. And the last would be a plea for essential unity around the word organic. Let's presume that organic is regenerative and make sure it is. And if it isn't in one part of the world, where you come from, then direct your energy to NOSB to upgrade organic standards in America. And I would say in Europe, let's question the validity of the US-EU equivalency agreement. There's several reasons why there are real holes in it. And I would have said we should start to lobby to say it was an inappropriate agreement based on a false sense of equivalency. And why it's critical, and this is a very specialised issue, fortunately the audience is also reasonably small and specialised. It's important right now because with the regulation being revised and moving towards an import approach based on full compliance rather than equivalence, the fact that the American agreement with Europe slipped through on the basis of equivalence, which will no longer be permitted by the European Union for imports where they're moving to full compliance, it becomes quite a hot issue. So regenerative, yes, but that's a problem in America. How much it is in Europe, we need to think about that too.
Yeah, but I have to disagree because I think the battle is not already finished. I mean, we need to work with equivalency, and it's so stupid that we in Europe think that we are. If we have to tell everywhere, they have to do like we do, like the Americans actually have been doing. Inside Europe, it is so different, and I've been there at the beginning, Chris from the IFMU, and then now I'm still there as IFM Italian representative. I see that we cannot, I mean, that is a way. We needed to have a way, especially in the southern of Europe, because if you were back in the 90s, without a law, you were out of law, meaning they were sequestrating your products and bringing you not even to prison, but almost. So we needed to have an organic regulation. But that, I mean, of course, regulation are regulation. Regulation is a baseline. And I don't really care if they allow nitrate, Chile and nitrate in the US, or even in Europe we have shortcut organic farming, allowing by the regulation that is a compromise, and a compromise to go below. But that is a starting point, it's not the finishing point. I think we need to have organic as a matter like we do in IFOM. Even non-certified organic is good. I mean, we want to have organic principles. These are our direction. I don't like these black and white systems. I work in a certification organization, but I hate the bureaucracy that is being thrown to farmers, especially to small farmers. And I hate that that is a reflection. Yes, but
I shouldn't have started this.
Yeah, you touch a point. We need to have an equivalent system and a principle-driven farming, and we go beyond organic. And I just remember, 25 years ago, Miguel Altieri came to my hometown. We made the first organic agriculture conference in the Mediterranean region because it was at the time a northern Anglo-Saxon system with a big problem of gap of languages with the Mediterranean. Organization at that time, they were doing like what they're doing now with developing countries, picking up fruit products for their markets in the south without touching and connecting with the local movement. This cannot be anymore, anywhere. Miguel at that time showed me, he was so excited to see conventional farms, small farms in my area, having a mixed system of farm, maybe using a little chemicals, but very mixed and very family. And now I have to say, some of those farms were destroyed by what I said before. Some organic one had to change the system, their farm system and way of trading. Agroecology, I think, like we did do in our conference that Charlie is here, she was supposed to say it, I say, next week we're going to celebrate the 25th anniversary and we have the title Agroecology for Organic Agriculture in the Mediterranean. The same. Regenerative agriculture for organic agriculture. We have to have a common frame and then inside push the best practice, go beyond, not be flattening down by the regulation, but go, and the IFOM in this level is tomorrow, start saying something strongly. We need to go beyond, but the base should be, we have a common language. We don't make trouble because otherwise the people we want to convince, the people we want to take on board, they will be more and more shocked. They would not have enough, they don't have all the insight we have. They have to be told simply and not making dispensation too much. So agroecology is part of organic farming. Regenerative agriculture is part of organic farming. Let's go that way.
Okay, thank you very much, Antonio. Thank you very much to all in the panel. I think we become very clear at the very end. It's not the end of today. It's not the end of the discussion. It's not actually the end of what we can debate about. There will be many issues, and I think for the time being, for this session, we will leave it here because I think you all deserve also a certain rest. And I think it is our panelists, they really deserve a big applause, and thank you very much. Just one hint or three hints quickly. I would like to refer to tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll debate Organic 3.0 in this very room. Christopher Stokes will moderate, and some of actually the audience will also be tomorrow in the speakers round. The other hint which I wanted to make is actually Organic can feed the World Action Network as a manifesto. This manifesto is actually, Antonio, is it on the internet, which can be signed, which can be supported. And the third one, there is, as I said, debate going on, Agro-Bio-Mediterranean, IFOM Mediterranean is going to have a conference next week in Vignola. So the debate goes on. Continue to engage. Thank you very much.